Marvis Frazier was a defensive mastermind with an Olympic path laid out in gold. But he wasn't just a boxer. He was the son of an icon. From national titles as an amateur to complete dominance in the ring, his potential seemed limitless. But what happens when you aren't what Daddy expects you to be? If you think you know the story, think again. I'm going to go crazy and try and kill you. That's what Larry Holmes told Marvis Frazier before their infamous match. What came next was a devastating first-round TKO, live proof, many said, that Marvis wasn't cut out for big fights. They said he had the perfect jab. They said he could have been an Olympic champ. But one decision turned it all upside down when his father ripped away his successful style and rebuilt him in his own bruising image. Why did Joe take over his training? And what was lost in the process? Before you make up your mind, you need to see how it all unfolded from triumph to tragedy. The legacy Marvis carried didn't come from a distant figure in history books. It lived right at his own dinner table. His father was Smokin' Joe Frazier, the man who had beaten Muhammad Ali in the fight of the century, the man whose left hook became boxing folklore. That kind of name wasn't just famous, it was monumental. Growing up in White Marsh, Pennsylvania, Marvis lived in a 16-room house surrounded by comfort and safety, a world far removed from Joe's childhood of hard labor in Beaufort, South Carolina, but privilege brought its own test. Marvis didn't wrestle with hunger or survival. His fight would always be with the weight of comparison, living up to a standard the world had already set for him before he threw a single punch. Life in White Marsh looked polished from the outside, but boxing was still central to the household. For the Fraziers, the sport wasn't just a career. It was their family identity. Training camps were part of daily life. Blood and sweat were as common as laughter at the table, and the sound of leather gloves popping against bags became the backdrop of Marvis's childhood. From the first time he pulled on gloves, people wondered if he could be the next Smokin' Joe. And how could they not? The name itself carried a crown Joe had fought, bled, and earned. Whether Marvis was ready or not, that crown hovered above his head. But here's the problem. Joe's drive in the ring had been fueled by desperation, sharpened by years of poverty and survival. For him, boxing wasn't ambition, it was escape. Marvis, on the other hand, didn't face the same hunger, literally or figuratively. He never had to wonder about where the next meal would come from, and that reality always raised questions. Could he summon the same relentless fire his father carried, the kind only bred by hardship? Still, Marvis didn't see those circumstances as a burden. While outsiders constantly referred to the shadow of Joe Frazier, Marvis himself rejected that framing. As he explained years later, he wasn't living in his father's shadow at all. He was standing in the light of it. To him, the legacy wasn't trapping. It was guidance. He wasn't trying to outrun Joe. He wanted to walk beside him. That pride in his lineage became one of his shields against the outsiders who expected him to stumble under the pressure, and the pressure was constant. Joe had 10 children, but Marvis, as the eldest son, was the one expected to carry the boxing mantle. Analysts and reporters loved the story. The champion father passing down the crown to his son, the lineage as clear as royalty. Even when Marvis worked tirelessly at his craft, every success was judged not on its own merits, but by how much it resembled or fell short of his father's. Yet if people thought Marvis was only where he was because of his name, they were missing the bigger picture. He really was talented. He had an amateur record of 56-2 and collected serious accolades along the way, including the 1979 National Golden Gloves and the 1980 National AAU Heavyweight Championship. Those weren't just participation trophies. They were proof he belonged. Coaches and boxing insiders recognized his potential not because of his last name, but because of the way he fought. That style was nothing like Joe's. Joe pressed forward, absorbing punishment just to land his thunderous shots on the inside. Marvis was the opposite. He worked behind a sharp jab, moved with controlled footwork, and relied on head movement to limit the damage coming back at him. People started calling him a tactician, even a defensive specialist, a fighter whose ring IQ stood apart. The contrast was striking. Joe was aggression embodied, while Marvis sought precision and patience. But for all his technical brilliance, the comparisons never stopped. Every time he stepped in the ring, critics boxed him in between what he was and what Joe had been. And Joe himself, sitting close by, wore two hats, one of a proud father watching his son thrive, and another of a world champion with a sharp eye, silently evaluating what still needed changing. That combination, love mixed with expectation, would become one of the defining forces in Marvis's career. In those years, though, the story still felt like it was shaping into something special. With his early success and growing reputation, the path ahead seemed wide open. Recognition piled up, the Olympics were in sight, and Marvis appeared ready to craft an identity that separated him, however slightly, from the long shadow of his father. Even before the turning point of 1980, boxing insiders were talking about his steady rise. What they didn't know was that the next stage would test whether Marvis's gifts and his mindset could carry him to greatness, or whether his father's legacy would take over entirely. By the late 1970s, Marvis wasn't just another name on the amateur circuit. He was quickly building a reputation as one of the most skilled young heavyweights in the country. Under the guidance of George Benton and Val Colbert, he developed a style that couldn't have been further from his father's. Benton often described him as a defensive genius, and anyone who watched him in the amateurs knew why. He wasn't interested in overpowering opponents with brute force. Instead, Marvis worked the outside, circling with sharp footwork, flicking a quick jab to control distance, and slipping shots with timing that seemed far ahead of his years. The numbers backed it up. By the time his amateur career came to a close, Marvis had compiled a 56-2 record, with major titles like the 1979 National Golden Gloves and the 1980 National AAU Heavyweight Championship on his resume. And these weren't hollow wins. He beat some of the best young fighters in the country along the way. Names that would later become world champions or top contenders fell to him in the amateurs. He outpointed Tim Witherspoon, boxed brilliantly against Jimmy Clark, and notched victories over future pros like Mitch Green and Tony Tubbs. Beating these fighters before they rose to prominence showed just how polished and effective Marvis was at his best. What stood out wasn't just the wins, but how he secured them. Marvis would stay on the move, sliding just out of range, firing his jab, and punishing opponents for mistakes without leaving himself exposed. For purists of the sport, the fans who admired skill and ring IQ, he was a joy to watch. Where Joe Frazier had thrived on high-pressure combat, walking men down to the ropes and grinding them out in the trenches, Marvis thrived on control. Benton believed that, handled properly, this version of Marvis could excel in the heavyweight division by neutralizing bigger, slower fighters who couldn't keep up with his movement and quick hands. That contrast with his father's style only made him more fascinating to observers. Joe's reputation had been built on survival and pressure. Every fight was a storm of hooks and intensity. Marvis, by comparison, looked like he belonged to another era of boxing altogether. Benton even compared him favorably to past masters of technique, stressing that Marvis could be the kind of heavyweight who didn't just beat opponents physically, but dismantled them mentally. To Benton and Colbert, His best chance at greatness wasn't through imitation of his father, but by leaning into this identity as a technical, defensive fighter. Outside the ring, Marvis had none of the brash confidence or fiery exterior that people often associated with heavyweight fighters. Soft-spoken and respectful, he carried himself quietly at press events or during interviews, letting his skill inside the ropes do the talking. That calm demeanor at times led some to question whether he had the fire needed to dominate at the pro level. But fight after fight, he continued proving that he belonged among the best amateur heavyweights in the country. Talk of the Olympics and even future world championships began to swirl around his name. For a moment, the comparisons to Joe took a back seat. Marvis was making his own mark, showcasing a style unlike the one fans had grown accustomed to seeing from a Frazier, and experts were starting to buy in. The path ahead looked like it could be golden. Amateur titles, an Olympic berth, and eventually a carefully built professional career. It all seemed to line up as the natural next step. But boxing has a way of complicating even the most promising stories. That came in 1980 at the Olympic trials. Facing James Broad, a much larger and more physically imposing heavyweight, Marvis was suddenly matched with a style that neutralized his strengths. Broad's size and strength smothered Marvis's movement, cut off his jab, and left him unable to dictate the pace of the fight. The result wasn't just a loss, it was a decisive defeat that erased any hope of competing in the Moscow Games. A setback like that can shake a fighter's confidence, and in Marvis's case, it raised unsettling questions. Could a defensive, outfighting style really hold up against the giants of the heavyweight division? Could his speed and skill be enough to overcome opponents who had overwhelming physical advantages? For the experts and fans who had been talking about his bright future, it was a bitter reminder of the realities of the heavyweight landscape. Still, in most cases, a loss in the Olympic trials would have been treated as a stepping stone, a chance to learn and grow stronger with the support of the same trainers who had helped sculpt him into a 56-2 national champion. But for Marvis, this single defeat had consequences far beyond the loss itself. It wasn't just about what happened in the ring that night. It was about who would take control of his boxing future afterward. Because for Joe Frazier watching from the sidelines, this wasn't just one bad fight. It was proof that his son's carefully built style wasn't enough, that the cautious defensive approach would never keep him safe in a division filled with giants. And that belief set in motion a dramatic change that would alter not only Marvis's style, but his entire career trajectory. Marvis had proven himself a star in the making, a fighter with intelligence and skill who had already beaten some of the best rising talents in the country. But one defeat at the Olympic trials changed everything. After the Olympic setback, Joe Frazier stepped directly into his son's corner, and everything about Marvis's training began to change. George Benton and Val Colbert, who had carefully developed Marvis as an outfighter, were pushed aside. In their place, Joe took control and shifted his son toward an infighting, pressure-based style. It wasn't a tweak or refinement. It was a fundamental redirection built on Joe's conviction that the only way to survive at heavyweight was to fight like he had. Head down, shoulders rolling, and fists flying until the opponent broke. To Joe, this wasn't theory. It was the exact approach that had carried him through boxing's golden age, toppling names like Ali, Quarry, and Bonavena, and delivering him the world title. In his mind, that path wasn't just successful, it was the only proven way forward for a heavyweight. But what Joe saw as tradition, many in the boxing community recognized as a risky experiment. Sports writers and analysts questioned whether Marvis's frame or temperament fit that rugged mold of constant warfare inside. Even with Joe's pedigree, they warned, trying to remake Marvis into a miniature version of his father came with danger. The physical mismatch was clear from the start. Joe had been built like a block of granite, shorter, stockier, with legs that could drive him forward endlessly, and short arms designed to whip hooks at full power. Marvis was taller, leaner, and carried less natural bulk. If Joe resembled the tree stump that could not be moved, Marvis was closer to the sapling, more reliant on movement than on brute strength. Where Joe's physique thrived on bruising exchanges in the pocket, Marvis's was better suited to range and speed. Forcing one mold onto a body designed for another was a gamble, even before you considered instincts, because the truth was, Marvis didn't have the impulse to grit his teeth and welcome a war the way his father had. Joe could endure storms of punches just to land his left hook. Marvis had cultivated a different instinct, one built around slipping, parrying, and minimizing risk. Those natural inclinations had made him an exceptional amateur technician. Stripped away, they left him vulnerable in exchanges he was neither physically nor mentally built to win. Still, Joe had absolute belief in his method. He'd fought every style the heavyweight ranks had to offer, from giants like George Foreman to ring wizards like Ali, and he knew firsthand how unforgiving the division could be. In his eyes, unless you could survive inside, take punishment, and force your will on an opponent, you simply weren't cut out for the heavyweight crown. And with his eldest son now carrying the family name, Joe wasn't about to let him venture forward without the armor that had carried him to glory. The motivations behind Joe's takeover weren't cruel or selfish. They were a complicated mix of fatherly love and projection. On one hand, this was Joe wanting to hand his son the crown he had once worn, using the only blueprint he fully trusted. He believed deeply that his son had greatness within him, and he didn't want to see that potential wasted on a style he felt wouldn't stand up against the best. On the other hand, Joe was also reliving a piece of his own story, trying to graft his hard-earned experience onto Marvis and remold him in his own championship image. In that effort, Joe sometimes struggled to see that his son's gifts were different from his own. Marvis, caught in the middle, faced the tension daily. The father who loved him was also the trainer trying to change him. Every time Marvis stepped into the gym and practiced weaving in behind a crouch, working to bulldoze bigger men, he was reminded of what he had been before, an agile, intelligent fighter who had beaten some of the best amateurs in the world his way. Now that identity was slipping further behind him, replaced by a version forged out of obligation, loyalty, and a father's unshakable conviction. Spectators picked up on the strain. To the public, Marvis wasn't just an up-and-coming heavyweight anymore. He was the son of Joe Frazier reshaped in his father's shadow. Every fight became a test case for the experiment. Could Joe really transform his taller, leaner son into a weapon that could succeed against the biggest men in the division? Or would the forced imitation expose more weaknesses than strengths? Those were the questions hanging over him as he moved into his professional career. Despite steady wins over lower-tier opponents, the doubts never quieted. Each victory looked workmanlike enough, but his performances often lacked the raw explosiveness fans expected of a heavyweight brawler. Doubts gnawed at the edges of every headline and ringside recap. Critics whispered louder, was this really Marvis's style? Or was it just Joe's style stitched onto a body that couldn't quite carry it? For Joe, though, the debates meant little. He had lived through harder nights than most of those writers could imagine, and he trusted what he had lived. If pushing Marvis into deep waters earlier than expected was what it took to harden him, then that was the route he was prepared to take. He wasn't interested in slow build-ups or cautious matchmaking. He wanted Marvis tested immediately and against the best. That philosophy soon found its proving ground. As Marvis's profile grew, he was rapidly steered toward a challenge that would shock analysts and overwhelm even loyal supporters. The plan Joe believed in, the experiment that had redefined Marvis's training, was about to meet one of the most dominant heavyweights of the era. And the results, once the bell rang, would leave nothing hidden. On November 25, 1983, Marvis Frazier entered the ring not just as a rising prospect, but as a fighter being rushed into a gamble that many believed bordered on reckless. He had turned professional 2 years earlier and compiled 10 wins, respectable for a newcomer, but nowhere near enough experience to face a reigning champion. Across from him stood Larry Holmes, unbeaten at 44-0, then the dominant heavyweight of the post-Ali era. The numbers alone told the story. Holmes was battle-tested against the division's elite, while Marvis wasn't even ranked by the WBC. In fact, the WBC flat-out refused to sanction the fight, dismissing it as a mismatch unworthy of world title status. And yet the bout went ahead, sanctioned by the newly formed USBA, with Joe Frazier in his son's corner, pushing him forward toward the chance of a lifetime. To outsiders, the decision looked like pure hubris. Why throw a talented but inexperienced heavyweight into the deep end so quickly? Was it blind faith from a father, or something else altogether? The answer, as so often happens in boxing, was complicated. A shadow hung over the Frazier camp that few truly understood at the time. Marvis was dealing with a severe neck condition. It dated back to the 1980 Olympic trials, when he suffered pinched nerves during his loss to James Broad and later experienced partial paralysis. Doctors eventually performed surgery, leaving a 5-inch scar across his neck. Though cleared to box professionally, the injury never fully disappeared. The Fraziers knew this. They knew his career could end sooner rather than later. For Joe, the calculus was cold. Get the money and big fights now, while the window remained open. So was this matchup reckless or desperate? A bit of both. The pressure was real, financially and medically. Joe had burned through much of his fortune from his own fighting days, and still carried the responsibility of supporting a large family. A fight with Holmes meant a payday that could ease those burdens and perhaps secure Marvis's future. That combination of urgency and love put Marvis in the most dangerous position of his young career, standing across the ring from one of the most skilled heavyweights of all time. Holmes himself wasn't fooled by the narrative. He had heard the hype and couldn't ignore the warning signs. In press conferences before the fight, he made it clear, "They're moving this kid too fast." It wasn't said with cruelty, but concern. Holmes had climbed through the ranks patiently, fighting his way past setbacks to earn his position. Watching the young Frazier skip steps on the ladder struck him as unfair more than anything else. Once the bell rang, it was clear how right Holmes had been. From the opening seconds, his jab, arguably one of the greatest in boxing history, snapped Marvis's head back and dictated the entire rhythm. Marvis, following his father's blueprint, tried to push inside with a bobbing, crouching style, but he lacked the explosive compactness Joe had. Holmes, taller and sharper, read every move with ease. Within moments, he landed a crushing right hand that left Marvis stunned. The end came swiftly. Holmes, sensing the opening, unleashed a measured flurry of punches that showcased both his power and precision. Marvis was overwhelmed, unable to mount a defense. With only a few seconds left in the opening round, about 2 minutes and 57 seconds in, the referee stepped in and stopped it. Holmes had won by TKO in the first round, and Marvis, undefeated no longer, sat dazed beneath the weight of reality. What followed backstage added another layer to the story. Away from the cameras of the fight, In the locker room, Marvis broke down. Tears streamed as years of expectation, pressure, and love collided with the crushing disappointment of his first professional defeat. Joe, so often remembered for his toughness and pride, pulled his son close and whispered, "I love you." It was a rare and tender moment that revealed the complicated truth. Whatever mistakes Joe had made in fast-tracking his son, whatever criticisms could be leveled at the decision-making, his role as a father came first. That hug cut through all the noise, but sympathy didn't silence the backlash. Pundits called it reckless matchmaking. They argued any objective trainer would have held Marvis back, given him time to grow, maybe even steered him into the light heavyweight division, where his frame and style might have proved more natural. Some critics went further, presenting Joe as blinded by nostalgia, trying to mold his son into the image of his younger self without regard for the clear dangers. Yet when held against the facts, the fragile reality of Marvis's neck, the family's financial position, the decision to face Holmes looks less arrogant and more like a desperate roll of the dice. For Marvis, the loss was both brutal and illuminating. He had been thrown in with an all-time great at just the wrong time in his development and paid the price. Still, unlike many fighters broken by such a setback, he returned to the gym. He trained, he fought, and he collected wins on the comeback path. The Holmes fight hadn't ended his career, but it had burned its mark into public perception. Marvis Frazier was now seen as the talented son who had been rushed too far, too fast, and for all his efforts to rebuild, that perception lingered. Because in boxing, sometimes it only takes a single night to define someone, and sometimes another even shorter fight can seal that definition forever. In July of 1986, the next defining moment in Marvis Frazier's boxing story arrived. On the 26th of that month in Glens Falls, New York, he stepped into the ring with Mike Tyson, a man who, at just 20 years old, was already a storm tearing through the heavyweight division. Tyson came in at 27-0, with his reputation for quick, brutal knockouts preceding him into every arena. His name was no longer a whisper in gyms. It was a roar across the entire sport. For Marvis, this wasn't just another fight. He'd rebuilt himself after the Holmes loss, stringing together important wins over tough opponents. He had gone the distance in unanimous decisions against James Quick Tillis and James Bone Crusher Smith, fighters respected for their toughness and ability to test rising heavyweights. He'd also beaten Jose Ribalta, another well-regarded contender who would later push Tyson further than most. These victories were real proof that Marvis was not some undeserving prospect. He had shown grit, boxing skill, and the ability to succeed against strong opposition. But all of that progress remained fragile, overshadowed by one problem. When his name appeared next to Tyson's on the fight posters, people remembered Holmes more than any of those wins. On fight night, the energy inside Glens Falls Civic Center was heavy with expectation. Tyson cut his way to the ring with that now familiar glare, an expression that stripped away any illusion that this was going to be just another boxing contest. It was more like a public execution in the imagination of the fans and writers watching. Marvis, quiet as ever, kept his composure in the walk to the ring. But the gulf in presence was undeniable. One fighter radiated menace. The other looked steady but out of place, carrying a calm that felt fragile against Tyson's intensity. The bell signaled the start, and within seconds, Tyson passed through what little space existed between them. He didn't ease into the fight, didn't measure distance or test reactions the way most pros did. He was crouching, bobbing, weaving, closing the gap with frightening speed. Marvis tried to throw his jab, tried to create distance, but Tyson had already slipped forward. The destructive sequence came almost instantly. Tyson dipped left, came up with a thunderous right uppercut, and drove it directly through Marvis's chin. It all unraveled in seconds. Marvis's legs betrayed him, folding even as he staggered back toward the ropes. Tyson capitalized with a furious follow-up, clubbing him with hooks as Marvis slumped. The referee, Joe Cortez, rushed in. He later admitted that he abandoned the count early because Marvis was completely unresponsive. There was no chance he would make it up safely. The official time was just 30 seconds of the first round, making it the fastest knockout of Tyson's professional career. In the stunned silence that fell before the cheers, you could sense the weight of what had just happened. Tyson had stamped his dominance in a single violent burst, and Marvis, once again, was left as the fallen man, remembered more for the disaster than the road he had traveled to get there. The replays sealed it. In the days and weeks afterward, the image of Tyson's uppercut, followed by Marvis collapsing into the ropes, was shown relentlessly on sports highlight reels. It became the shorthand, the reference point, the one clip that came up whenever Marvis's name appeared. His victories over Tillis, Bone Crusher, and Ribalta, forgotten in the haze. His 56-2 amateur record, his Golden Gloves and AAU titles, erased for most fans. That half-minute knockout became the lens through which nearly everyone viewed his career. It's easy to imagine bitterness growing from an outcome like that, but that wasn't Marvis's way. Years later, he spoke about what happened, and rather than placing blame elsewhere, he acknowledged the truth, plainly. Tyson was great, and he had misjudged what he was up against. He admitted that he'd looked at Tyson like just another opponent, when in reality Tyson's explosive style demanded far more than he brought to the fight. There were no excuses, no resentment, and no attempts to rewrite what millions had seen. That humility in many ways revealed the core of who Marvis was. He wasn't blind to the narrative that now defined him, but he understood something deeper. One moment, even one played back endlessly, didn't have to sum up his life. Boxing fans and historians would attach his name to that flurry and that knockout forever. But Marvis himself found peace by accepting the result without shame. Outside the orbit of highlight reels and commentators, those 30 seconds became less of a curse and more of a turning point. The Tyson fight didn't push him into denial or desperation. It shifted him toward a path where boxing was no longer the centerpiece of his life. He would step away from the sport just 2 years later, retiring while still young by heavyweight standards. At that moment, the challenge became something far bigger than fighting in a ring. The real question turned toward how Marvis Frazier would find meaning and identity once the gloves were hung up for good. By the time Marvis Frazier retired in 1988, he was only 28 years old. In boxing, that's an age where many fighters are hitting their prime, or looking to take their careers to new heights. But for Marvis, the fire to continue had burned out. The weight of 2 defining losses, to Larry Holmes and Mike Tyson, hung over his career, overshadowing the hard-earned victories he had fought for in between. Rather than grind through another stretch of fights to chase what might never come, Marvis made the decision to step away from the ring on his own terms. It wasn't an easy choice, though. For a man whose identity had been so deeply tied to boxing, walking away felt less like retirement and more like a personal transformation. What came next would define him far more than any fight ever could. Boxing, unlike other sports, often clings to its losses more than its wins. A highlight reel defeat can stick to a fighter's name forever, no matter what they achieve before or after. Marvis understood that better than most. He knew his reputation in the public eye would always begin with those 30 seconds against Tyson, amplified over years in slow-motion replays and montages of knockout greatness. But while the spotlight in boxing often leaves people scarred, Marvis chose to turn away with grace. He didn't need to prove anything between the ropes anymore. Instead, he focused on something bigger, redefining his legacy outside of the sport. If there was one thing Marvis took from the Frazier name, it was the sense of resilience. Joe Frazier had built his life on fighting through adversity, and Marvis wasn't about to let his story be one of failure or regret. That sense of resolve sent him in a new direction, one rooted in faith, service, and giving back to the community. He became a minister, trading the roar of an arena full of fans for the quieter, but no less important role of counseling and guiding others. If boxing was a battle of the body, ministry became his way of battling for the soul. He worked with at-risk youth, speaking to them about purpose and perseverance, hoping to inspire kids with stories of struggle and recovery. But perhaps some of Marvis's most meaningful work came behind prison walls. Moving into prison ministry, he took time to speak to inmates about redemption and second chances, using his own experiences to connect with people who felt forgotten by the world. He wasn't just the son of a heavyweight champion here. He was someone who had faced failure and kept walking forward. For many he encountered, his authenticity offered hope. Here was a man who had been judged by millions in defeat, but didn't let that define his self-worth. Those lessons he learned in boxing, pain, commitment, resilience, became tools to teach others how to approach their own struggles. Marvis never shied away from reflecting on his boxing days in interviews and public appearances. He spoke about his pride in carrying the Frazier name, framing his career in a light that wasn't tied to wins and losses. "I wasn't in the shadow of my father," he famously said. "I was standing in his light." To Marvis, the love and belief Joe had shown him, even in their missteps, outweighed any criticism fans or analysts threw their way. He could have spent years being bitter about his career, about the direction Joe had taken it, about being rushed into fights he didn't feel prepared for. But that was never Marvis. He saw his journey as part of a greater purpose, even if it didn't end in world titles or mainstream glory. His post-boxing years reframed the narrative surrounding him. What looked like a cautionary tale to others became a story of redemption and transformation. Marvis didn't fade into obscurity or turn to self-destruction the way some fighters do after leaving the ring. Instead, he built something stronger, a life grounded in service. His work wasn't just about preaching to congregations or counseling individuals. He also became an advocate for youth programs, emphasizing education and discipline as tools for success, lessons he wished more young people had access to in his own time. In time, Marvis shared his story with the world in another format. In his autobiography, Meet Marvis Frazier, the story of the son of Smoke and Joe. In it, he pulled back the curtain on his boxing career, his family relationships, and his struggles with living up to a name that carried so much weight. Rather than shy away from the hardest moments of his life, Marvis approached them with honesty. He wanted people to see the whole picture, both the fights and the faith that carried him through them. The book became a rallying point for his message of resilience, further cementing his place as more than just a boxer. Even in retirement, Marvis remained connected to his father's legacy. He often appeared in documentaries or special media features about Joe Frazier's life, offering personal insights into one of boxing's most legendary figures. But if you watched closely, you could see Joe's pride in Marvis whenever they were shown together. He'd seen his son step into the sport and leave it on his own terms, carving out a legacy that wasn't measured by championship belts, but by the impact he had on others. And in the end, isn't that the kind of championship that matters most? While boxing fans might remember two nights against Larry Holmes and Mike Tyson, Marvis's story didn't end in the ring. It wasn't about what happened inside the ropes, but what he built long after the crowd stopped cheering. He found his purpose, his own identity, and through it all, a way to redefine the Frazier name as more than just about fighting. In walking a path of service, Marvis turned his career into something deeper, proof that even when the spotlight fades, you can still stand in the light. Marvis Frazier's story comes down to one question: what does legacy really mean? For him, it was both a gift and a burden. Born the eldest son of Smokin' Joe, he lived under constant expectation but found his own way to define success. As Marvis himself put it, he wasn't living in his father's shadow. He was standing in his light. That choice shaped his life far more than 2 knockout losses ever could. His legacy today rests in ministry, resilience, and service. So what do you think? Did Joe make Marvis a champion? Or did he cost him his prime? Drop your thoughts in the comments, and if you want more deep dive boxing stories like this, don't forget to subscribe.